again. I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org. And I'm back this time with my first video looking at lenses for Sony, the Sony 24-70 f2.8 G Master lens, and the Tamron 28-75 f2.8. At first glance, the Tamron has a lot of potential. It's shorter and quite a bit lighter than my Sony G Master, but the price tag looks good too, just under $800, while the Sony costs almost 3 times that much. We'll take a closer look at the bodies of these lenses later. There are some important differences, but I think the best place to start here is by looking at how much wider a 24mm lens is than a 28. Here's a shot from a tripod with the Tamron at 28mm, and here's the same shot with the Sony at 24. Let me do that again. Here's the 28, and here's the 24. And this overlay shows both. In this photo, nothing important is getting cut out, but it's easy to imagine cases where this difference would be important. Keep in mind that with some nearby subjects, you'll be able to take a few steps back and fix the problem, but you'll never be able to get the exact same photo as using a wider lens by moving back, since close subjects will be affected, but distant backgrounds won't be if you just move back a little bit. Anyway, the opposite end of these zooms is not as significant a difference. Here's the Sony at 70mm, and here's the same shot with the Tamron at 75. 70 and 75. As you can see, the difference in framing is pretty modest with the 75mm lens, and you can easily get the same perspective with the 70mm lens by cropping a little bit. You just lose about 4 megapixels of resolution with the A7R III. There's more detail about all of this in the full review on my website, but now let's see how good the sharpness and resolution of the Tamron are compared to the Sony. For these shots, I used my standard testing procedures, but I discovered that the Sony RAW files include chromatic aberration corrections that are automatically applied by the RAW converter. So keep in mind that these are partially corrected results. Wide open in the center of the image, I found that the Tamron lens was a little bit sharper, though they're pretty similar. The Tamron is a little bit more contrasty overall, which improves the sharpness, but resolution is great with both lenses. At f4, they both get a little bit better, and there's even less difference, but maybe the Tamron is still just a touch sharper. Not much though, it's not a practical difference for real-world use. At 5.6, not much changes. Both have improvements in resolution, but the Tamron is still marginally better. And at f8, they're just about indistinguishable, but the Tamron has a little more contrast, which makes it look sharper. Moving away from the center, things are a little different. Here, the Sony resolves just a little bit better than the Tamron, though it's a subtle difference. You can see it in some of the text on this clinic and on the signs on i5. At f4, the Sony makes a nice jump in resolution and looks a lot sharper. And the Tamron doesn't really improve at all. In fact, it looks like it gets worse, but maybe that's just next to the sharper Sony. At 5.6, the Sony stays about the same, and the Tamron improves a bit, but it still doesn't catch up. The Sony is still giving us more detail on the street signs and crane details. At f8, the Tamron continues to improve, and it's almost on par with the Sony now, but I'd still give the edge to Sony. Again, it's subtle and not really significant. Now, moving down here to the bottom corner, things start to get really weird. At f2.8, they're both just a little soft, but again, the Sony is significantly sharper. That's not weird. What is weird is that when we stop down to f4, the Tamron actually gets visibly worse. I've never seen that before. I checked this against the other 4 duplicate shots of this with the Tamron to see if this was an anomaly or something, like maybe I bumped the camera, but of course, that would have shown up in the center of the image. And remember that in the center, it was sharper than at f2.8 and sharper than the Sony. At f5.6, the Sony continues to get sharper, and the Tamron gets better too, though it's still lagging behind. And at f8, they're getting pretty close, and they both look good, especially for the corner of a wide-angle zoom lens. just to be sure that the weird f4 drop in resolution wasn't just a problem in this corner, I also checked around the image. Here's the upper right corner, and if you look at the text on any one of these signs on the freeway here at f2.8, you'll see that when I stop down to f4, it just gets more blurry, but starts improving again at f5.6. Weird. However, the 70mm end of the Tamron lens is where it really shines. Check this out. Wide open in the center of the image, the Tamron is much sharper than the Sony. Again, it was a big enough difference that I had to check the duplicates and make sure that I hadn't bumped the camera with the Sony. At f4, the Sony improves quite a bit, and is close to catching up with the Tamron, but doesn't quite make it. The Tamron looks even sharper here. At f5.6, the Sony looks excellent, and I'd say that the difference between the two is negligible here. The Tamron is a little more contrasty, but it's a close call. At f8, there's no obvious improvement with either lens. They're still about the same. So moving away from the center again, the Tamron is still obviously sharper at f2.8. You can actually read the express lanes text here, for example, although the difference isn't quite as big as it was in the center. At f4, they both get sharper, and now you can read the olive way sign on the Tamron side pretty easily. Stop down to f5.6, they both look great, and they look just about identical to me, with a little more contrast on the Tamron side. And there are no obvious changes when you stop down to f8. And finally, if we look down at the corner, the images follow the same pattern. The Tamron is significantly sharper at f2.8, where the Sony is pretty soft. At f4, the Sony gets a lot better, and the Tamron maybe improves a little, but is still sharper than the Sony. At f5.6, they're pretty much even, but this time it's the Sony that looks a little bit sharper. And at f8, they're identical as far as I can tell, and they're both really nice and sharp. So I won't bore you with additional comparisons here, but if you want to see some, there's another video in the full review on my website. There's a link below. But I was more interested in how the Tamron would perform as a general purpose lens. So before I started testing autofocus, I just went out to do some general shooting around the city. You never know what you'll run across. I found that the focus performance was great, and I got plenty of rich textures and details from the optics. And this was kind of interesting. While I was walking near Pike Place, I ran across this old guy who was doing his best to look sharp, but had clearly seen better days. I chatted with him for a few minutes, and I discovered that he was J. William Oldenburg. He was a Donald Trump-type character back in the 1980s, and he was the owner of the LA Express USFL football team. Here's a picture of him with Steve Young, his star quarterback. But Mr. Oldenburg was charged with fraud and lost nearly everything in the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, so I took a photo of him next to this giant piggy bank and moved on to take some more photos around the city. This is Kalina Mosqueda-Lewis of the Seattle Storm. And since this lens is nice and lightweight, I thought I'd give it a shot with a bit of a hike up in the Cascades. But the weather didn't really cooperate. The visibility was terrible, but I did find that the lens was good for shooting detail shots along the way. For just a moment when I was on the peak of Mount Catherine, the clouds cleared for long enough for me to see that the rest of the mountain range really was still out there, before being engulfed again in the mist. I've been shooting longer with the Sony lens, about 7 or 8 months, so I've been all over the country with it. I shot various landscapes with it in Utah, Wyoming, and Montana, in the sand dunes of Colorado and the painted hills of Oregon. I shot a little architecture too, like these ones from Charleston. And of course, I also have standard family vacation shots, and it has performed exactly as I'd hoped for a G-Master lens, with great image quality and autofocus performance, even in low light. And speaking of autofocus, I wanted to take a look at how the Tamron's autofocus would handle shooting action and sports, but it was a little harder than I thought it would be. Since it was the end of summer, football hadn't started yet, so I decided to go to my local skate park and take some shots there. On my first visit, there weren't many real skaters there, but while I was trying to take some shots anyway, this little kid in a yellow cape appeared out of nowhere and attached himself permanently to my side, even if that side was between me and the skaters I was trying to shoot. In fact, especially on that side, and started asking me an endless stream of questions. By the time his little voice gave out, all the skaters had left, and I decided I'd better come back another day. So a couple of days later, I tried back again, and there were still no real skaters, but almost as soon as I got there was this little kid in the cape, this time proudly showing off his coupon for a free Slurpee. On my third visit, though, there were plenty of skaters, and the Tamron performed nicely. This seemed like a good test to me. As the skaters came up this bowl, they'd completely disappear and then reappear, and the camera would have to grab focus. And it did. The Tamron locked quickly and maintained focus throughout each jump or trick. In fact, I had better results with the Sony A7R III than I had with my Canon 5D Mark III in previous tests. When basketball season started, I also shot some games in the low light of some high school gyms. And again, the Tamron performed just as well as the Sony lens, although it's sometimes hard to tell with the noise from the high ISO that I had to use. As I mentioned, I had already been using the Sony for several months and had shot dozens of basketball games with it, so I knew that it performed well, even in some very poorly lit gyms in Spokane. So I didn't notice any difference in autofocus performance between the two, but I should mention that with both lenses, I always lose focus when I'm tracking a moving subject and I zoom the lens in or out. That probably has more to do with the camera than the lenses, though. Okay, I said that I would come back to the differences in the bodies of these lenses in more detail later, so I am, but there's not a whole lot to say. As I mentioned before, the Tamron lens is shorter and lighter than the Sony, but it's also much smaller in diameter. The Sony has 82mm filter threads, and the Tamron has 67mm. The bodies of both lenses are primarily some sort of plastic, but they are both weather sealed, although that doesn't always mean much, and I didn't test it. The position of the focus and zoom rings are switched between the two lenses, but the zoom rings do turn the same direction in both cases, an opposite of what is typical for Canon lenses, incidentally. You'll notice pretty quickly that the focus lock button on the side of the Sony lens is missing from the Tamron. But what I found more of a concern was that the autofocus switch is also missing. It's not a problem very often, but in those cases when I want to use manual focus, it's annoying that I have to go into a menu to switch it off, even if that's pretty quick and easy on the A7s. Finally, it's worth mentioning that the maximum magnification ratio of the Sony lens is about 1:4, but with the Tamron, it's variable, about 1:4 at the 75mm end, but 1:3 at the 28. This is because the minimum focus distance drops from 39 centimeters down to just 19 centimeters at the 28mm end. The small size of the Tamron lens probably contributes to the one area where the Tamron seems to have an unusual problem. So before I wrap up this video completely, let's take a quick look at the lens's vignetting. At the wide angle end, we get a little darkening in the Tamron's corners starting around f4, and getting pretty noticeable by f2.8. With the Sony, there's a little darkening wide open at f2.8, but it's gone as soon as you stop down at all. At the other end of the zoom, though, the Tamron has a little darkening in the corners as high as f5.6, and it steadily increases until f2.8, where it's prominent. The Sony lens has very little here, just a touch in the very corners. So to sum things up, the wide-angle end of the Sony lens is an obvious advantage, and the modest difference at the 70mm end doesn't really matter. But the weight and compact size of the Tamron are also a big advantage. The build quality and body features are about the same, but I give the edge to the Sony just because it has an autofocus switch and a focus lock button. At the wide-angle end, I give them a tie since the Tamron is a little better in the center at times, but the Sony is generally better away from the center. And at the 70mm end, the Tamron clearly has better resolution. Autofocus is a tie, and the Sony handles vignetting better. And the cost, of course, $2,200 for the Sony and $800 for the Tamron is a $1,400 difference. So where does that leave us? Considering the excellent image quality of the Tamron lens, and the size difference, and the Tamron's dramatically lower price, it only makes sense to consider the Sony G-Master lens if you do a lot of work at the wide-angle end and really need the 24mm perspective. Some people will. I found that when I had both lenses on my shelf, I usually reached for the Tamron lens instead of my Sony when I was heading out for a shoot, and that says a lot to me. And that's it. If you found this useful or interesting, and if you'd like to see more videos about Sony lenses, please press the like button and let me know in the comments below. And of course, subscribe if you're interested in seeing more videos like this.